Welcome to our first lecture of the week. This is for Monday, February 8th, 2021, and we're going to shift gears from our discussion of industrial America and the robber barons and things of that nature that we spoke about on Wednesday and Friday of last week. Individuals, companies, and trends that were mostly confined to the northeastern and eastern states of the Midwest, I should say. And we're going to take a look at life in the South, particularly from a business and economic standpoint, as well as a political and social standpoint during the final decades of the 19th century and the first couple of decades of the 20th century. So that's what we will cover in today's lecture. But before we begin, I just want to make a note with regards to the upcoming primary source analysis assignment number 1. I know a couple of you have contacted me via email and asked about a rubric. The rubric for this assignment will be posted on Wednesday, February 10th. That's Wednesday of this week. And the assignment will be due on Thursday, February 18th. So I have pushed it back one day from Wednesday the 17th to Thursday the 18th. So you will have 8 days, or approximately 8 days, from the time that the rubric is posted until the deadline to submit. So more on that later, and for now we'll just leave it at that and move forward with today's class discussion. So there's 3 things that I want to discuss at length today, and that is first the industrialization of the South and how some of the trends and some of the industry and jobs that were prevalent in the Northeast and the Eastern Midwest, places like Cleveland and Ohio and cities of that nature, along with the industrial Northeast. We talked at length about that last week. But the South is trying to industrialize as well at the same time, but it's a little bit trickier there in terms of how they can get industry to come to the South and bring jobs with it and economic growth with it. So we'll begin with that discussion and then move forward to how Jim Crow became a reality in the South by the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, and we'll look at it from 2 angles, a political angle and a social angle. So let's talk about industrialization in the South. In the wake of Reconstruction, some prominent Southern businessmen and journalists realized that the South could not subsist and thrive on an agricultural economy alone. In the first half of the 19th century, the antebellum period before the Civil War, agriculture was basically the Southern economy, and so much of it was cotton, or as it was referred to in the South, king cotton. But the destruction of Southern property and Southern farms over the course of 4 years of the Civil War, as well as the industrialization and wage labor that became prevalent in the Northeast after the war ended, convinced Southern leaders that they could no longer rely just on agriculture and just on king cotton to continue to grow and develop economically. And they were very cognizant of the fact that one of the major advantages that the Union states the Union Army possessed in the Civil War was a resources advantage, tremendous resources advantage, with far more factories which could produce weapons and munitions at a much quicker and more efficient rate, and transportation, railroad lines. There were far more railroads in the North during the time of the Civil War than in the South, so they were able to get those weapons and supplies in the hands of the Army much more quickly and more efficiently than the Confederacy could do with their army. They just had better methods of transportation and a much more manpower and machinery in place to mass produce items through factories that already existed in the North. Very little, if any, of that is in the South during the same time period, and so the leaders of the South after the Civil War, in some cases, blamed the defeat on the fact that the North had more manpower, more resources, but regardless of how they felt about the outcome of the Civil War, they knew that the South needed to get more railroads, get factories and industrial jobs to come to the region in large quantities in the final half of the 19th century in order for the South to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, economically, keep up with the rest of the country from an economic standpoint. So, several of these prominent business leaders and journalists, boosters, if you will, for the region, came up with a term in which they sort of fashioned the South as a term to frame a narrative of the South, and that term was called the New South. And the biggest proponent of this new terminology was a man named Henry W. Grady. Henry Grady was a journalist who became managing editor and part owner of the Atlanta Constitution in the 1880s. He had previously worked at another newspaper in Atlanta, the Atlanta Herald, but he had a very powerful position amongst the elite leaders of Atlanta in the 1880s as a man who would frequently write editorials in the Atlanta Constitution and also oversee the overall coverage of what got in the paper and what didn't. Many of those editorials were devoted to the idea of the New South, that the South must attract industrial jobs and expand its agricultural output beyond just cotton in order to achieve sustained economic growth going forward. And Grady did not just rely on newspaper editorials to get the word out. He became a traveling spokesman for the region, going all over the South and all over the Northeast and the Midwest, giving speeches, meeting with business leaders, trying to do whatever he could to convince these folks that the South was worth an economic investment, that the South, that perhaps they had in mind the pre-Civil War antebellum South that was reliant on agriculture and also slave labor, that no longer existed, and that the South was open for business, if you will. Very pro-business, business-friendly type of message, but a message that was designed to sell the region to the capitalist business leaders of the Northeast and the Midwest, who, in hopes of luring factories and jobs and into the South during that time. The most prominent speech that he gave, in which he extolled the virtue of the New South as an emerging industrial marketplace, was a speech before the New England Society in New York City in 1886. And Grady's efforts did wind up producing some very clear, tangible results, particularly for the city of Atlanta, the city where he resided and where he was part of the elite professional class. He promoted Atlanta more than any other city in the region, viewed it as the unofficial capital of the New South, and believed that Atlanta was the perfect place to bring these industrial jobs and factories and means of industrial and vocational education. And it worked, as I said, to a degree. In the 1880s, the mid-1880s, Atlanta received a new college dedicated explicitly to vocational and industrial education. That college was known as the Georgia Institute of Technology. It still exists in Atlanta today. It's known by most folks by its more casual moniker, Georgia Tech. So if you're familiar with Georgia Tech or heard of Georgia Tech, it is the Georgia Institute of Technology. It was established in 1885, and Henry Grady promoted the idea of Georgia Tech and the idea of that type of school coming to the South and to Atlanta, because he realized that a workforce could be developed for those types of industrial jobs if such a school existed in the South and in one of the prominent cities in the South. So due to in part to the fervor of his New South rhetoric, Atlanta received Georgia Tech. In addition to this new college devoted to industrial and vocational education, he was also able to convince northern companies to help fund cotton expositions in the South. These were fairs that promoted industry, promoted cotton as a product for textile mills and distribution that could be, factory produced once you had the raw material in hands. And there were cotton expositions in Atlanta in 1881, 1887, and 1895. It resulted in major financial commitments from northern companies and brought industrial jobs to the city of Atlanta. And the 1895 Cotton States Exposition in Atlanta was a significant event, which we'll get into more on Wednesday in our discussion for Wednesday's class. But over there in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, you can see a photograph of Henry W. Grady. And if you are from the Metro Atlanta area, Grady Hospital in Atlanta is named for Henry Grady. For the moment, Grady High School is named for Henry Grady, although they are in the process of renaming Grady High School. And the University of Georgia's College of Journalism is also named for Henry Grady. Grady died suddenly 2 days before Christmas in 1889. So, New South and the New South narrative promoted by Henry Grady and others resulted in industry coming to the South in the form of industrial jobs and factories and other areas where the South could participate in the industrial economy. But what did that look like exactly? What do I mean when I say that there was a growth of industrial development in the South during this time period? Well, let's take a look at a few examples, a few tangible products and industries which began to grow significantly and thrive in the South during the 1880s and the 1890s. And we'll start with textiles. Textile mills used cotton, as the cotton that was picked from the fields was sent to the mills where it was produced and distributed for cloth materials and things of that nature. Prior to the 1880s, the majority of textile mills in America were located in the Northeast. A lot of mill towns, small mill towns, where the textile mill was the basic center of the town because it provided the bulk of the jobs, the economic hub of the town. And from the 1880s forward, textile mills emerged as a growth industry in the South, and quite a few textile mills began opening up. To illustrate that, in 1880, there were 161 textile mills in the South. By the turn of the 20th century, approximately 400 textile mills were located in the South. So in just 20 years, a tremendous increase in the overall number of textile mills in the South. This provided more jobs for Southern residents. The majority of these jobs were actually filled by women and children. I remember when we discussed the robber barons last week that the labor laws that we think of as commonplace in America today did not exist back then. So there was no federal minimum wage in this time period, nor was there a 40-hour work week or any sorts of limitations in terms of how much work could be done by companies and corporations and factories. And so you often had 59, 60-hour work weeks and longer. And there were no restrictions on child labor during this time either. So children could join their parents, and particularly their mothers, in the textile mills and work. So that's sort of what it looked like in the textile industry in the South during this time. But it would become a major economic growth sector as the last 2 decades of the 19th century unfolded, and throughout the first half of the 20th century, particularly the first 3 decades or so of the 20th century. Outside of textiles, we can turn next to tobacco. If you are familiar with colonial American history, early American history, you know that tobacco was one of the earliest major crops developed in the South. And tobacco reemerged as a major business in the final 3 decades, the final 30 years of the 19th century. And the reason why there was a resurgence of tobacco, which had never really gone away, but why it became an economic factor again, was the addition of factories in the South. And in particular, the Duke family, a prominent family in Durham, North Carolina. They opened a factory in the early 1870s, and that factory began to produce an exponentially higher supply of tobacco than in previous generations, previous decades. They've produced approximately 125,000 pounds of tobacco per year through the Duke family factory, and that enabled the business to grow. James Buchanan Duke, who was the second generation proprietor of the family tobacco company, his father, Washington Duke, had been the founder of the company, but James Buchanan Duke also known as Buck Duke, oversaw this development with the factory producing much more tobacco, and he revolutionized the tobacco industry by mass producing cigarettes through the mechanical and technological advantages that the factory provided that had previously been unavailable to generations of Southern tobacco businessmen, Southern tobacco farmers in the 18th century. In addition, he invested heavily in advertising and marketing in order to increase the sales of his tobacco products, particularly his cigarettes. He figured that the combination of the factories producing these cigarettes at a quicker rate and a larger rate, and combine that with some clever advertising, and you could really increase your sales to a much larger extent than you perhaps ever thought possible. Duke recognized that, took advantage of that, and as a result enhanced the family wealth through those means. We talked about the robber barons last week with John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, as well as J.P. Morgan. All of those robber barons were based in the Northeast, or in the case of Rockefeller in Cleveland, Ohio, in the sort of eastern edge of the Midwest, if you will. James Duke, you could make a strong case that James Duke was the southern version of a robber baron. Very wealthy family, and very much at the top of his business, his family's business at the time, but really at the top of the tobacco industry. And I mentioned that the Duke family was from Durham, North Carolina. If you're familiar with Duke University, that was originally Trinity College, but in the 19th century, Washington Duke, the father of James Buchanan Duke, had given an endowment to the school. It remained Trinity College until the early part of the 20th century, early 1920s, when James Buchanan Duke gave a much larger amount of money to the school to aid the school's endowment and enhance its growth in the future. And after that endowment was received in the 1920s, the school was renamed from Trinity College to Duke University. So James Duke, the namesake, or the Duke family, the namesake of Duke University. Quick tangent, another example of a Southern robber baron during the second half of the 19th century was Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a shipping and later railroad magnate in the South. And as you might have guessed, Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, is named after the Cornelius Vanderbilt family, again, as they received a large endowment from that family in the early years of that university. So, the Southern robber barons, for lack of a better term, James Duke and Cornelius Vanderbilt, two of the most prominent of that group of folks during the same time period when Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan were the robber barons of the Northeast. In addition to textiles and tobacco, there were other new industries that began to grow, develop, and thrive in the South during the final years of the 19th century and the dawn of the 20th century. Coal mining became very prolific across the region from West Virginia to Alabama. And as a result of the coal mining, steel production was possible. Birmingham emerged as the South's most prolific producer of steel. And in the process, the city earned the nickname the Pittsburgh of the South, the Pittsburgh of the South. So some of you that may be from Birmingham or have family or relatives in the Birmingham area, the reason why it's called the Pittsburgh of the South is the late 19th century through the first half of the 20th century, steel was a major part of the local landscape, and particularly a major part of the local economy in Birmingham. In addition to coal mining and steel production, lumber becomes a very popular industry, a growth industry during this time, particularly with construction of new buildings, new wood frame houses being built around this time. In the early part of the 19th century, or 20th century, I should say, 1901 to be precise, oil is discovered in the Southwest, and that becomes a major growth industry in the South throughout the early part of the 20th century. Hydroelectric power becomes a major part of the industrial economy in the Southeast during this same time period. So those are a few of the industries that really emerged during the latter 30 to 50 years or so of the 19th century in terms of the industrialization of the South. Textiles, tobacco, and newer industries such as steel, lumber, oil, and hydroelectric power. However, just because the South became more industrial during this time period, agriculture remained a central component of the region's economy. The South was not going to unseat the Northeast as the industrial hub of the U.S., no matter how many factories and jobs were added during this time. And so many Southerners worked as farmers during the last quarter century of the 19th century. Unfortunately for these families, very few of them actually owned the land that they farmed. The majority of Southern farmers during this time were either sharecroppers or tenant farmers. And they consisted of mostly black men and white men and their respective families. Sharecroppers usually had no land and no real equipment, and so they worked a portion of a landowner's farming acreage using that owner's equipment or spare equipment, and in return they received a portion of the crops that they were able to produce. Usually it was about half, but it varied from individual farm to individual farm, and it was very much hard work and very daunting economically, I should say. It was a type of work that you just couldn't depend on producing a crop every year or producing the same level this year that you had the year before or that you might the following year. It was very fickle business to enter into, but sharecroppers often had very little other options for employment. Same thing with tenant farmers. Tenant farmers might own some farming equipment, might be able to acquire some equipment and goods from the local country store due to a credit account, but they still didn't own land, and they would receive a portion of the land that from the landowner, work that portion, farm that portion, and get a chance to keep, like their sharecropper counterparts, keep part of the crops that they were able to harvest. Usually they were able to keep a bit more than sharecroppers because they were able to provide their own equipment in most cases. However, both groups, sharecroppers and tenant farmers, really consisted of the working poor. Very few sharecroppers and tenant farmers escaped poverty. They rarely produced enough crops to cover their own expenses for the year and avoid getting into debt. And as a result, it was difficult to accrue any kind of savings to one day use to purchase their own land. So land ownership remained an elusive goal that stayed just beyond the grasp of the overwhelming majority of the men and their families that worked as sharecroppers and tenant farmers in the South during this time. And they were very much so the working poor by and large as a group. And you can see a example of a sharecropping family in the picture in the upper right-hand corner there. So now that we've discussed the economic changes in the South during the latter portion of the 19th century, as well as the overall economic picture in the South during that era, let's take a look at politics and race and the color line. We talked during our lectures on Reconstruction about the tremendous political changes and upward social mobility that black Southerners, and particularly black Southern men, were able to acquire in the Reconstruction era with the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, or the addition of the 13th Amendment, I should say, the passage of the 1866 Civil Rights Act, the addition of the 14th Amendment, which made the 1866 Civil Rights Act constitutional, and finally the passage of the 15th Amendment, which provided black Southern men with the franchise, with the right to vote. And in turn, many black Southerners voted for Republicans as opposed to the Southern Democrats, the conservative group of white politicians that had led the way for secession in the Civil War. But as I mentioned, by the end of Reconstruction, the redeemers of the white politicians, who were mostly conservative Southern Democrats, finagled their way back into power through a variety of means, most notably the Compromise of 1877, which removed Southern troops removed federal troops, I should say, from the South. So, as we get to the 1890s, the last decade of the 19th century, white politicians in the South begin to attack the franchise. They begin to actively try to disenfranchise black men and remove them from the voting rolls in the South, and in turn from the political sphere overall. They did this in a variety of ways, beginning with a constitutional convention held in Mississippi in 1890. The purpose of it was to strip black Mississippians of their voting rights. This convention and the legislation that emerged from this convention was known as the Second Mississippi Plan, and it consisted of several new voting requirements, each of which provided an obstacle for black residents who sought to vote in elections. First and foremost, they required a residency stability. You had to have been a resident of Mississippi for at least 2 years continuously, and you had to live 1 year in the election district to vote in that district's elections. That doesn't sound like a major obstacle for most people, but you have to consider that most of the black labor force during this time period were sharecroppers and tenant farmers who frequently moved around. They were transient workers trying to find the best farming land to be able to till as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, and they frequently were not in the same place from 1 year to the next. So the residency requirement doesn't sound like a huge deal, but it did trip up plenty of black men from registering to vote and for exercising their right to vote. In addition to the residency requirement, there was a criminal history clause added, and basically any residents with convictions, no matter how small and inconsequential those convictions were, petty misdemeanors, anything of that nature, if you had any of that on your record, you were removed from the voting rolls. Remember, I discussed some of the Jim Crow laws, the black codes that were actually put in place before the Jim Crow laws in Reconstruction with the vagrancy laws. Those laws in many cases were still on the books, and if you were a black male in a small southern town and you were asked to provide proof of employment and you didn't have it, maybe you were in between jobs at that time, you could be charged with and convicted of vagrancy, and that could strip you of your right to vote. That in and of itself could strip you of your right to vote. Another method that was used to remove black voters from the rolls, I should say, is the poll tax. A tax of $2.50 was brought about by the state of Mississippi as part of this second Mississippi plan. You had to pay that $2.50 tax by February 1st each year in order to remain a voter on the rolls. $2.50 does not sound like a lot of money in contemporary America today, but in 1890, that was a substantial amount of money. If you adjust for inflation, $2.50 in 1890 comes out to approximately $72 in today's 2021 money. And I mentioned the sharecroppers and tenant farmers of the region often found themselves in debt, and very few of them had $72 available at their disposal to pay a poll tax. But nonetheless, that was required in order to keep voting in elections. There was a literacy test, or what was known as an understanding clause, that was also added as a requirement during this time period. This disproportionately affected black residents, especially older black residents who were prohibited from earning an education when they were slaves. Not all of them had taken advantage of opportunities to gain an education after Reconstruction because they needed to work to make money, make ends meet. And so if you were illiterate, you had to take a literacy test, and if you couldn't pass it, if you were illiterate, then you were removed from the voting rolls. However, there was a loophole that illiterate white men could use in order to stay on the voting rolls and avoid being stripped of their voting rights. That was what's known as the understanding clause. The understanding clause basically said that if you could demonstrate a clear understanding of the U.S. Constitution, to the satisfaction of your local county registrar, then you could vote. That county registrar could certify you to vote. So white men didn't necessarily have to be literate to vote, as they could use the understanding clause as a loophole to remain a voter in good standing on the rolls. And then finally, there was the grandfather clause that was instituted in Louisiana initially in 1898. This provision was another way in which illiterate white men could continue to vote. All they had to do was prove that either their father or grandfather had been an eligible voter on January 1st, 1867, a date which predated the 15th Amendment passage, which gave black men the right to vote. So there were no black men in the region that could prove that their father or grandfather were eligible voters on New Year's Day, 1867. But white men could often do that, and if they were illiterate, they could keep voting as long as they could offer that proof. After Louisiana passed the grandfather clause in 1898, a slew of other states in the South followed suit, I should say. Among those were Georgia, Virginia, Alabama, North Carolina, and Oklahoma. All of those states had adopted the grandfather clause by the year 1910. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, that is a document from North Carolina in 1902, I should say, in which the voter provides documentation that his father or grandfather was an eligible voter on January 1st, 1867, and he provided that on October 22nd, 1902, and as a result of the grandfather clause evidence, he was able to register to vote or renew his registration to vote in the state of North Carolina. So we mentioned disenfranchisement and all the various ways in which Mississippi and the other states in the South opted to disenfranchise their black voters in an attempt to get black men out of the political process. So what were the ultimate results? Well, the majority of black men are blocked from voting, which means they can't participate in the political process, they can't make their voices heard and choose the candidates they want or vote for or against particular legislation that might be on the public ballot. It means participation in the political process at the municipal level, the state level, and the federal level is virtually impossible for African Americans in the South at this time. And to demonstrate the effect that it had, the number of black voters in Louisiana dropped from approximately 130,000 in 1896, 2 years before the state initiated the grandfather clause, to approximately 5,300 by the year 1900, 2 years after the grandfather clause took effect in Louisiana. In Alabama, in 1900, an estimated 121,000 black adult men were literate, yet less than 3,800 black men were registered to vote in Alabama, most likely tripped up by one of those other obstacles, perhaps the grandfather clause, perhaps the poll tax, perhaps the residency requirement. There were any number of ways in which they could be sidetracked from voting, prevented from voting, even if they were literate. And so without the franchise, with the elimination of the franchise for black men, white Southerners took a stranglehold on politics throughout the region. Their candidates, mostly Southern Democrats, won all of the political offices, and with no meaningful political opposition, once in office, they passed a series of Jim Crow laws that segregated transportation and public spaces in the South. Schools were segregated by race. In addition, restaurants, buses, railroad cars, public restrooms, and many other areas, virtually any area in the public space, was either whites only or blacks only or colored only, as the term was used then. These laws were explicitly designed to establish a color line and reinforce white supremacy in the region during this era and going forward. There was a legal case that wound its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court called Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was a light-skinned black man who refused to give up his seat in a whites-only section of a railroad car to go to the colored section, and he later challenged the Jim Crow law in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. It made it all the way to the Supreme Court in 1896, and the Supreme Court ruled that segregation laws, Jim Crow segregation laws, were legal as long as the facilities used by blacks and whites in the South were, and this is the key phrase here, separate but equal. If they were equal spaces, they could be separate so that you could have whites only and colored only, or blacks only, if you will. White Southern politicians used the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court ruling to maintain segregation, but in truth, the public spaces and facilities were never equal. Black Southerners were forced to accept inferior public facilities and inferior seating in transportation, theaters, restaurants. Oftentimes they couldn't eat at the same restaurant as their the fellow white citizens in the city or the region could. And if they could dine from the same restaurant, they usually had to go to a back entrance and get their food to go from a back entrance rather than sit inside the restaurant. In addition to all of those public spaces and public facilities, Southern state governments always appropriated more money and funds and resources from their public education budgets to white schools. The white elementary schools and middle schools and high schools got the lion's share of the money, which enabled them to have nicer buildings and nicer facilities and hire and retain more qualified teachers and faculty. In addition to that, the public colleges and universities in the South were largely unavailable, almost exclusively unavailable to black students if they were what's known as a PWI, a predominantly white institution. So in the 1890s and the early 1900s, you could not attend the University of Mississippi or the University of Alabama or the University of Georgia or Mississippi State if you were a black high school graduate. The only public colleges and universities in the South available to black students during this time period were HBCUs, that's historically black colleges and universities, such as Jackson State and Alcorn State in Mississippi, Alabama State and Alabama A&M in Alabama, Florida A&M in Florida, and I mentioned Bethune-Cookman in Florida, founded by Mary Bethune, who we talked about earlier this semester, and Morehouse Spelman in Atlanta University in Atlanta. I believe all 4 of those schools, at least the 3 Atlanta schools, were actually private schools. They are HBCUs. They were founded as HBCUs, and they remain HBCUs today, but they were private schools, so their budgets weren't necessarily affected by southern state governments. But certainly Alcorn State and Jackson State and Alabama State and Alabama A&M and Florida A&M, aka FAMU, in Florida, Tennessee State in Tennessee. Those were all public colleges and universities that were HBCUs. Mississippi Valley State was as well, but Mississippi Valley State was not founded until the middle of the 20th century. So that's not during this sort of advent of the social Jim Crow system that takes place and becomes the social and political rule of the land, the region, beginning in the 1890s and the first decade of the 1900s, the 20th century. I will stop the lecture here today. That will conclude today's lecture, and we will pick up on Wednesday with a few concluding topics on Jim Crow segregation and the new political and social order within the South during this time, and we'll also return to the Northeast and the Midwest to discuss labor crises that were unfolding across the major cities and urban areas during that time. So again, that wraps up today's lecture, and I will talk to you again on Wednesday.